I used to use it regularly to go and see the matches that I was interested in on Court 1. I won't go there now. I won't go anywhere near.
He sold more than 250 million records worldwide, was knighted by the Queen, and even once rivaled Elvis in fame. But behind closed doors, Cliff Richard was facing several storms no one saw coming. And it all began when he battled a betrayal so deep it shattered everything he thought he knew about fame, faith, and loyalty. What really happened to the man who spent 6 decades in the spotlight and then disappeared without a word? And what caused him to retreat so completely? The answer cuts deeper than you would have ever imagined. The rise of a legend. Cliff Richard was born Harry Roger Webb on October 14, 1940, in Lucknow, during the final years of British colonial rule in India. His family, like many Anglo-Indians of that time, was caught between two worlds. They were British by heritage but raised under the Indian sun. That dual identity would quietly shape Cliff's outlook on life before he ever stepped in front of a microphone. When India finally gained independence in 1947, the Webb family, like so many others of British descent, made the journey back to England. They arrived in Carshalton, Surrey, and later settled in Cheshunt, Hertfordshire. But this so-called homecoming wasn't the warm welcome they might have imagined. The post-war Britain of the late 1940s and early 50s was gray, tired, and suspicious of outsiders, especially those who didn't quite fit the mold. And young Harry, with his sun-darkened skin and foreign birthplace, quickly learned how cruel children and adults could be. At school, he was taunted and ridiculed. He was called names that no child wants to hear. Being born in India made him a target. His darker complexion earned him slurs like "indie bum," a term that stuck with him for years. These early experiences left a mark, not just emotionally, but psychologically. They chipped away at his confidence and ignited a lifelong hunger to prove himself. And that hunger for validation, coupled with a perfectionist streak that would follow him through every decade of his career, pushed him to seek refuge in music. He started modestly by forming a group called the Quintones in the mid-1950s and performing covers of American songs that were starting to trickle into post-war Britain. But it wasn't until he adopted the stage name Cliff Richard that things began to take shape. The name Cliff was meant to suggest something solid and strong, while Richard was a nod to Little Richard, one of his American idols. Everything changed for Cliff. In 1958, he recorded a song called Move It, a raw, rhythmic track that electrified the UK's teenage population. At a time when British pop was mostly tame and ballad-driven, this song arrived like a jolt of energy. Even John Lennon would later say that before Cliff Richard, there was nothing worth listening to in British pop. The song climbed to number 2 on the UK singles chart, and just like that, Cliff Richard became the face of Britain's rock and roll scene. But while the music sounded rebellious, Cliff himself was not. Unlike the leather-jacketed, hard-living image of American rock stars like Elvis Presley or Gene Vincent, Cliff presented something more controlled. He was clean-cut, articulate, and almost studiously polite. Even in his earliest performances with his backing band, the Drifters, there was a clear contrast between the raw sound of the music and the restrained, respectable image of the man fronting it. But most fans never realized that it was all a deliberate choice. Cliff wasn't trying to be a bad boy. He wanted to be liked, not feared or idolized in the way other rock stars were. His image was safe for parents, appealing to young girls, and palatable for a British audience still clinging to post-war conservatism. In many ways, he was walking a tightrope by embracing the sound of rebellion while embodying the appearance of tradition at the same time. And that tension would define much of his early fame. Throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Cliff churned out hit after hit. His songs weren't just chart toppers, they became national anthems for a generation that was just beginning to understand youth culture. By 1962, Cliff Richard had already become a household name. He had starred in movies, sold millions of records, and performed to sold-out crowds across the country. In fact, there was a time when he outsold every other UK artist, including Elvis, on the British charts. But fame didn't just bring opportunity. It brought scrutiny, pressure, and unrealistic expectations. And yet, behind the carefully managed public image was a man who remained deeply private and never quite shook off the early childhood sense of being different, the feeling of being watched, and the desire to prove himself. He never fully embraced the chaos of the rock lifestyle, nor did he succumb to the trappings that destroyed so many of his contemporaries, but it came at a cost. Because while others used fame to rebel or indulge, Cliff used it as a shield. The perfectionism that had helped him survive childhood struggles now drove him to control every detail of his public life, including what he chose to keep hidden. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of his life was his decision never to marry. Was it a vow of personal freedom? A private struggle with faith and identity? Or something else entirely? A life without marriage. For decades, Cliff Richard's music spoke of young love, heartbreak, and romantic dreams. Yet, in real life, he never married, never had children, and rarely gave the public more than a glimpse into his private affairs. It was a decision that puzzled many and fueled endless speculation. In an era where pop stars were expected to settle down, or at least be seen dating, Cliff's quiet, unmarried life stood out. And behind that choice lay a complex mix of love, heartbreak, faith, and personal discipline. Cliff has always maintained that not getting married wasn't part of some master plan. It just happened that way. In his own words, he once said, "People often make the mistake of thinking that only marriage equals happiness. I may suddenly meet someone and feel differently, but right now I am not sure marriage would enhance my happiness." And while that sounds simple enough, the story beneath it is far more emotionally charged. When his career was in full bloom, Cliff reportedly fell in love with a fellow celebrity. Speaking about how they met, Cliff said, "We hit it off straight away. She was the sort of soulmate that you meet, and you know is a friend for life." According to Cliff's autobiography, this woman was the iconic Olivia Newton-John. But fate dealt Cliff a cruel hand, because while he was in love with her, she was already engaged to someone else and ended up marrying him instead. Rather than cause a rift or drama, Cliff stepped aside, a decision that, by all accounts, devastated him. He once said, "When I and many of us were in love with Olivia, she was engaged to someone else. I'm afraid I lost the chance." Years later, in a heartbreaking twist, she fell ill with cancer, and Cliff remained close to her throughout her illness, quietly visiting and offering support. When her final moments eventually came, her passing devastated him. According to reports, that one relationship seemed to seal a door inside him. He would go on to have close female friends, but never again did he come close to love on that level. Some fans say this private heartbreak shaped much of the emotional restraint the world has come to associate with Cliff Richard. To the public, he appeared calm, upbeat, and always smiling. But deep down, he carried emotional scars. And unlike many of his peers who played out their love lives in tabloids and headlines, Cliff withdrew inward. He guarded his privacy fiercely, not to hide something shameful, but to protect something sacred. And yet, the world wouldn't let him be. For most of his adult life, media speculation swirled about his relationships, especially about his sexuality. Some questioned whether he might be queer, while others suggested he was simply a lifelong bachelor by design. But Cliff, always the gentleman, refused to respond with anger or defensiveness. Instead, he met the rumors with quiet dignity. In interviews, he once said, "As for my sexuality, I am sick to death of the media's speculation about it. What business is it of anyone else's? what any of us are as individuals. I don't think my fans would care either way, reminding the public that his personal life was just that, personal. But this comment didn't stop the headlines from coming. Every close male friendship was analyzed, and every woman he was seen with became the subject of questions. But in the face of relentless scrutiny, Cliff remained composed. He understood that fame came with a price, but what hurt him most wasn't the rumors, it was the underlying assumption that a life without marriage must be incomplete. That because he didn't follow the conventional path, there had to be something wrong or something missing. But Cliff never saw it that way. For him, fulfillment came from elsewhere. His Christian faith had always been a cornerstone of his life. He became a devout Christian in the mid-1960s and made no secret of the role faith played in shaping his choices. It influenced his music, his friendships, and his conduct. But it also introduced its own kind of tension. Cliff once admitted that there were moments when faith didn't give him all the answers, and moments when his personal desires clashed with religious teachings. There were lonely nights. There were questions he didn't always know how to resolve. But rather than abandon his beliefs, he chose to live within that tension. To him, life wasn't about being perfect. It was about being honest, even when it hurt. His fans, especially those from religious backgrounds, admired this about him. He became something rare, a pop icon who maintained his values in an industry that often rewarded chaos. Yet even within that admiration, there were expectations. His public image had to be spotless, and his actions always above reproach. And so, Cliff built a life of order and discipline that kept the press at bay, but also left little room for personal vulnerability. But no image, no matter how carefully built, is invincible. After 5 decades in the spotlight, Cliff Richard had become more than just a singer. He was a symbol of longevity, respectability, and restraint. But in 2014, everything changed. Without warning, Cliff found himself at the center of a scandal so damaging and so intrusive that it would shatter not only his reputation, but his entire sense of safety. The 2014 scandal that shattered everything. By the time 2014 arrived, Cliff Richard had spent over half a century in the public eye. He was one of the few artists who had successfully crossed multiple generations, selling over millions of records worldwide, and achieving #1 hits in 5 consecutive decades. To many, he was more than just a musician. He was a national treasure and a comforting presence in British entertainment. But in August of that year, that entire legacy came under siege, in a way that no one could have predicted, and Cliff himself would never fully recover from it. On August 14, 2014, the peaceful quiet of Cliff Richard's Berkshire penthouse was shattered by the sound of knocking, followed by police entering the property. South Yorkshire police had arrived with a search warrant based on a single, anonymous allegation of historical inappropriate behavior. Cliff wasn't even home at the time. He was in Portugal. But it wasn't just the police that turned up. In a move that would later be condemned in court, the British Broadcasting Corporation arrived with cameras already rolling. Somehow, the broadcaster had been tipped off ahead of time and was given advance notice of the raid. What followed was one of the most invasive and shocking media spectacles in recent British history. Helicopters hovered above Cliff's residence, filming the search in real time. Reporters stood outside, narrating every move. Even though no one had been arrested or charged, Cliff's name flashed across every major news outlet, every television station, and every trending topic online. His face, often shown smiling and waving during concerts, was now linked to something dark, serious, and deeply personal. And yet, at the core of it all, there was one crucial fact. Cliff Richard was never arrested. He was never charged, and the allegations were unsubstantiated and eventually dropped. But by the time the truth surfaced, the damage was already done. In the aftermath of the raid, Cliff's world collapsed. The emotional and psychological toll was immediate and severe. Friends described him as a shell of himself. He became withdrawn, anxious, and visibly ill. He later revealed that he developed curious medical conditions as a result of the intense stress. He lost weight, he lost sleep, and he was even afraid to leave his home. In an interview, he said, "I never went back except to pack up my belongings. In my mind, it had become contaminated. I didn't feel comfortable there any longer. I have, in fact, been burgled before, and this for me was a worse experience." That sense of contamination wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The raid hadn't just disrupted his life, it had stained his reputation. For a man who had spent his entire life cultivating an image of respectability, discipline, and moral clarity, the mere suggestion of wrongdoing, no matter how false, was excruciating. Cliff had been raised to believe that innocence would always speak for itself, but in the court of public opinion, the accusation had already been tried. Cliff was never someone who sought confrontation, but in this case, he decided to fight back. In 2016, he launched a legal battle against the BBC, accusing them of breaching his privacy in their coverage of the police raid. The case went to trial in 2018, and the judgment was clear. The court ruled in Cliff's favor. The BBC was ordered to pay £210,000 in damages, along with significant legal costs that were over £850,000. In his victory statement, Cliff didn't celebrate. He sounded relieved but heartbroken, because the ruling didn't undo what had already happened. It didn't remove his name from the headlines. It didn't erase the images of police searching through his belongings on live television. Neither did it bring back the years of peace that had been stolen. And, most painfully, it didn't stop the questions from resurfacing whenever his name was mentioned. Years later, in 2022, Cliff opened up again about the lasting impact of the scandal. In a rare moment of raw honesty, he admitted that he still struggled with anger and disturbing thoughts toward the person who had made the false accusation. He once said, "I'm past it, but I don't think I'll ever be over it. You can't press the delete button in the brain. It's just always there. I hate the idea that people can do this to another innocent human." For someone who had worked so hard to stay out of controversy for over 5 decades, the experience was devastating. It shook the foundation of everything he had built, not just professionally, but emotionally and spiritually. The man who once believed in the strength of a good name and in the comfort of honesty and faith was now grappling with something that didn't follow any of those rules. The rules had changed, and Cliff was left trying to navigate a world that no longer felt safe. Even after clearing his name, the toll on his mental health lingered. Cliff became visibly more private, more cautious, and far less trusting. He spoke about the constant fear of being recognized not for his music, but for the scandal that had engulfed him. And perhaps that's the most tragic part of this story. For an artist who had spent his entire life avoiding the traps that destroyed other celebrities, who didn't indulge in recklessness, to be dragged into a storm he didn't create and couldn't stop, was profoundly cruel. He had survived decades of changing musical trends, shifting public tastes, and even media speculation about his love life. But this was different. This wasn't just a bump in the road, it was a full-blown landslide. And Cliff, despite his strength, couldn't pretend it hadn't changed him. It's no wonder, then, that he began to slowly withdraw. He stopped touring as frequently. He declined more interviews. He spent longer periods at his home in Portugal, where the press couldn't follow him so easily. The man who had once performed to crowds of tens of thousands began to treasure the quiet, anonymous spaces where no one asked questions. So why did he truly vanish from the spotlight? What finally pushed him to step back from everything he built? The answer isn't one thing. It's a slow unraveling that began with trust, was tested by fame, and ultimately undone by betrayal. Why he truly vanished. After the storm of 2014, Cliff Richard emerged into a world that no longer felt familiar, one where the spotlight that had once given him joy now felt like a threat. Though he was cleared of all wrongdoing, and though he won his legal battle against the BBC, the emotional fallout could not be undone with a court ruling. What had been violated wasn't just his privacy, it was his sense of safety, trust, and belonging. For Cliff, the experience cast a long and heavy shadow. His relationship with the media, already cautious, was now irreparably damaged. He had always played by the rules, giving polite interviews, maintaining his dignity, and never stirring up scandal. But when his name was broadcast to the world before a single charge had even been laid, when his home was searched on live television without him even knowing, something shifted deep inside him. His faith in the press, and even in the institutions he had once trusted, was broken. For a man who had proudly represented Britain on international stages for decades, who had been knighted by the Queen, and who had been celebrated for his clean, consistent image, this feeling of betrayal cut deeper than any single event. In the years that followed, Cliff began to withdraw, not in anger, but in protection. Public appearances became rare. He stopped doing long press tours, where once he might have embraced the attention. Now he recoiled from it. Even his beloved annual tours began to slow. The thrill of the stage hadn't disappeared, but the burden of being constantly watched and scrutinized, not just for what he sang, but for what people thought they knew about him, was no longer something he was willing to carry. There were still performances, of course. Cliff didn't vanish entirely, but something had fundamentally changed. He picked his moments carefully. The spontaneity was gone. The openness he once brought to interviews was replaced by guardedness. He no longer volunteered personal reflections as freely as he once had. The man who once joked, smiled, and shared warm memories with journalists was now more cautious with every word. And behind that caution was a lifetime's worth of sacrifice finally catching up with him. Cliff Richard gave everything to his career. From the moment Move It hit the charts in 1958, he became a figure of near constant public fascination. But fame came with a cost. He sacrificed normal relationships. He sacrificed privacy. He gave up the possibility of a conventional family life. He kept his personal pain quiet, always keeping the focus on the music. He stayed clean, stayed humble, and avoided controversy. He even gave the public everything they asked for, and more. But in the end, when he needed that same public to trust him, to believe in his innocence, many didn't. The headlines came faster than the facts. The damage came before the truth. And in that moment, the foundation he had built his life on felt as though it had been taken from him. By the late 2010s, it became clear to those around him that Cliff Richard was no longer interested in chasing fame. He had nothing left to prove. He had achieved more than almost any British artist in history. Dozens of chart-topping singles, international acclaim, a knighthood, longevity that even the Beatles, his once younger peers, hadn't matched. But the joy of it had faded. The spotlight that once energized him now felt like exposure. And the thought of facing another false rumor or another media frenzy was more than he could bear. Even fans noticed the difference. Although he still released albums and still showed up for special events, he had clearly drawn new boundaries. Fame was no longer the engine of his life. It had become something he kept at a distance. But what has life been like for him since then? How has he dealt with the natural process of aging, with his health, and with the reality of growing older in a world that still remembers him as forever young? Health, aging, and where he is now. Time moves differently for someone like Cliff Richard. For most people, aging happens in private, quietly, invisibly, without the glare of stage lights or the pressure of an audience. But for Cliff, every wrinkle, every slowed step, and every missed note risks being scrutinized by a world that still remembers him as the smiling, youthful heartthrob of the 1960s. Growing older is hard enough. Doing it in the public eye, after a lifetime of being seen as forever young, has its own set of challenges. Physically, Cliff has always been disciplined. He was never one to let his body go, even in his later years. Now, in his 80s, he maintains a careful fitness routine that's not extreme, but enough to keep him feeling sharp and strong. He's long been a believer in healthy eating, moderate exercise, and balance. For years, he kept up tennis and swimming, and even today, he credits his relatively good health to those consistent habits. But even the most devoted routines can't stop the march of time. In recent interviews, Cliff has spoken candidly about the realities of aging. His stamina isn't what it used to be. He tires more easily. Rehearsals that once energized him now require longer recovery. And when he performs live, something he still does on occasion, there's a new fear that wasn't there before, the fear of falling. He once confessed, "Well, I don't do what I have done in the past. I mean, 25 to 30 years ago, I'd be on stage and you'd have boy dancers. I can't do that anymore. In fact, I am worried to do it. If I did it and fell over or something like that, then that would be the end." That concern has quietly shaped how he moves, how he prepares, and how often he says yes to live shows. But the physical side of aging is only part of the story. The emotional toll has been deeper. Cliff once embodied youthful optimism. His fans saw him as a man untouched by time. But inside, he has wrestled with the same doubts and fears that come for anyone in their later years. There's the pressure to look young, to sound perfect, and to continue performing at a level he himself set decades ago. There's also the fear that people will only remember the last version of him they saw. And for someone who built a career on consistency, the idea of decline or not meeting expectations is a quiet, lingering weight. And yet, despite it all, Cliff Richard has not stopped. He's simply become more selective and more intentional. He doesn't tour constantly anymore, but he still records music. He still steps back into the studio with the same love he had in the beginning. In fact, his later albums have surprised even longtime fans, not because they break new ground, but because they stay true to the sound that made him beloved in the first place. In 2020, he released Music, The Air That I Breathe, a mixture of new material and duets, with artists like Albert Hammond and Bonnie Tyler. The album debuted in the UK Top 5, making Cliff the first artist to have a Top 5 album in 8 consecutive decades. This was a reminder that Cliff Richard may have retreated from the spotlight, but he's not done yet. The music is still there. The voice may have softened, but it hasn't vanished. Even when he does make public appearances at charity events, special concerts, or holiday specials, he's met with the same warmth from fans who've stood by him through every era. There's a tenderness to the way they receive him now. Not just admiration, but gratitude. He represents more than just hits from the past. He represents endurance, grace, and resilience in the face of pain. He now divides his time between his little homes around the world, far from the noise of British tabloids and flashing cameras. And yet, even in that quiet, 2 things remain at the center of his life: his faith and his music. Those constants have never wavered. In times of joy and in moments of unimaginable pain, his belief in God has grounded him. It's the lens through which he sees the world and the anchor that holds him steady when everything else feels uncertain. Music, too, continues to be his lifeline. Not in the way it once was, which involved climbing charts and filling stadiums, but in the deeper way it connects him to memory, to meaning, and to the people who still listen. Every time Cliff records a new track or releases a new album, he isn't just continuing a career. He's honoring a promise he made to himself decades ago to keep going, to keep singing, and to keep living with purpose. So while he may no longer be in the spotlight every day, Cliff Richard has not vanished. He has simply evolved. He has learned how to grow old with grace, how to protect his peace, and how to remain connected to what truly matters. Do you think Cliff Richard was treated fairly by the media? Tell us in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen. Like this video and subscribe to our channel for more updates.